You are listening to Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hey everybody, Colton here, podcast host of Here Before, Here Now. It's been a while since we had an episode come out, but today my guest was brought forth to me after I was speaking at a panel at ASU talking about indigenous perspectives when it comes to news gathering and also media coverage and things like that. And one of the media reps said, I have this great guest for you who I think would be really great to have on your podcast. Her name is Davina Two Bears. Right now, she is a presidential postdoctoral scholar at ASU School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and she has made a living in higher education. She had some of that foundation laid for her when she was younger. Her mom was a teacher, and she recently wrote an essay about Little Singer Community School, which is a school on the Navajo Nation, which was in response to the federal Indian boarding schools that were taking place across the country. This was a school that was implemented by community members with a curriculum that was extensive in Navajo culture and language. So really a place where native Navajo people could send their kids knowing that they would be passing on knowledge that was important to the people, whereas instead of going off the reservation into boarding schools meant to assimilate them and also to culturally rip them apart from what they have grown up with. So thank you so much, Aket, for being here on this morning. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, she Davina Two Bears, Yenishia, Turichini, Nashna, Tachini, Bashashin, Tabahi Dashache, Do Turichini, Dashanella, and City Tot Dan Nasha. And I learned how to introduce myself at Little Singer School, community school.
That's pretty amazing. I was reading about this essay, and we'll get to that, and also about these types of schools on the reservation. But tell me about your journey in somehow becoming an archaeologist and being this postdoctoral scholar at ASU.
Yeah, it's always been a dream of mine to just learn more about Native history. And I've always felt proud of being a Diné woman, and I've always been interested in how life would have been before colonization. So I think that really spurred my interest into becoming an archaeologist, and then just finding out that there aren't a lot of Native American archaeologists, and that our voices really need to be included in the field of archaeology, and that is something that I was very interested in becoming a part of, to make sure that our concerns that we have about our ancestors, those are being heard by, the mostly white archaeologists. But I think nowadays it's really changing, so that archaeologists are really beginning to listen to Native American, collaborate with Native people, and consult them for any archaeological projects. But I was working for the Navajo Nation for about 14 years as a tribal archaeologist and program manager for the Navajo Nation Archaeology Department. And I decided to go back to school and get my PhD because I just wanted the freedom to research Navajo history. And I'm not really using a lot of the traditional archaeological methods, because I focus on, I like to interview elders when I'm learning about the past, rather than digging up an archaeological site. I'm more interested in non-destructive research methods like oral history.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
When did that become something that you were interested in? Were you a little girl and I want to do this? Or was there something that kind of sparked your interest in this?
Yeah, well, I actually became interested in researching about a site in the communities of Loop and Bird Springs. And it was a federal Indian boarding school back in the early 20th century. People refer to it as the Old Loop Boarding School. And there's still a Loop boarding school in Loop, Arizona, but this boarding school was a separate area across the river, Little Colorado River, and it was called the Loop Agency School, Loop Training School, and it opened in 1909. And both of my maternal grandparents attended school there in the 1920s and 30s, and they used to tell me stories about their experience at Old Loop. And so just listening to my grandparents' stories, and learning about the boarding school later on, as I grew older, working as an archaeologist, I realized that this school had not been documented as an archaeological site, doesn't have a site number, even though it's it exists now as a large archaeological site, meaning there's, a bunch of rubble on the ground, and that's about it. And it's such an important place to loop community members because so many people went to school there and worked there over the years. And so it just really was a place I learned that so much about from my grandparents, and then I wanted to document that history because it doesn't exist. The Navajo history of this boarding school, even though it was there from 1909 to 1942, and additionally has another interesting historical reused as a Japanese American incarceration center. It was called the Loop Isolation Center in 1943, and there was about 70 Japanese Americans that were imprisoned at the Loop Isolation Center. So they repurposed the boarding school after they shut it down to oppress another group of Americans, and that was Japanese Americans, when they had that whole hysteria over, the World War II, and they were fighting the Japanese Empire. So, yeah. So, just learning about historical places on the Navajo reservation, I think is something that's really important. And I know that kids and young Navajos, they really like learning about their local history. So, it's just something that is, has always been important to me. Education and not just teaching Native or Navajo students, but also the greater public about Native American history and their local history that they may not know anything about.
Yeah, when it comes to the phrase archaeology or archaeologist, I envision someone at a site with those perimeters, with those strings, sectioning off things. What exactly is it? Because you don't do that then.
Yeah. I mean, archaeology, they look at what they call the archaeological record, quote unquote. And, in the past that has involved in the United States a lot of digging. And it was painful for a lot of Native indigenous peoples because, of course, those are our ancestors that, were dug up primarily. And especially regarding the fact that many of the things that were taken out of the ground were human remains and, associated burial items. So even on the reservation working as a tribal archaeologist, when other Diné people realize that you're an archaeologist, they're like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to say, what's the cultural impact when you tell others, I hear my grandmother, my Shmasana telling me, yeah, obai,
Yeah, that's exactly what my grandmother, would tell me, that I used to play around, her house. And one time I brought her some pottery and I thought they were so pretty because they were painted. Right, yeah. And I brought them to her and she yelled at me. She said, "Take those back. You don't touch those." Yeah. So, but on the other hand, I feel for me, I'm interested in the more recent Navajo history. And so I really like going to these sites that are so, beautiful places on the landscape. For example, I recently had a chance to reassess Navajo sites in the Chaco Canyon on Charca Mesa, in that national park there. And it was really, really just amazing to see these really old hogans from that were built maybe 1600s, 1700s. And then also the ones that were from the 1950s, because the reason why they're from the 1950s, they stop at the 1950s, is that's when the national park moved out all the Navajo people from there to establish that park. But their homes are still there. And it was really sad because I also realized that a lot of those families were from the Tuchitni clan. So they're very closely related to me on my father's side. And learning about this kind of history that's often quieted. You don't really hear about these kinds of things. But it's important to know, it's important to be educated on that kind of history. And I enjoy the opportunity to learn about the past in ways that are comfortable for me culturally, which, like I said, is a lot of interviewing elders, and then also doing archival research from, the records. I have gone to National Archives in Washington, D.C., which was a really great experience, inspiring to be there in Washington, D.C., and to look at these records, that were literally taken on the ground at the boarding school in Loop, handwritten notes. And I also saw my grandmother's name on those records, enrollment records there in the National Archives. So
wow.
Yeah, that was a moment that was really rewarding and also very emotional. Yeah. When I saw her name, I just started crying because she was only 5 years old when she had to go to boarding school, and just thinking, I have 3 young adult kids, and just thinking about how it would have been to have my child taken from me at 5 years old and not being able to see them or have them at home for, 9 months out of the year was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I know that boarding school and the phenomenon, the what happened has been talked about more in recent years. I know we've had some studies that come out that have showed like over 400 were in operation for several decades, thousands of kids killed. Remains still haven't been found for many of the families looking for answers. And this was a government policy sent to assimilate Native Americans. During your research, what have you found about boarding schools and the impacts that it still has to Native people and communities to this day? Yeah,
I think, well, definitely the fact that the culture was suppressed, and there's some surprising findings that I found. Of course, like you mentioned, the death of children at these schools. That was really shocking to me. Like, when I started my research, it was before there was a big media focus on Indian residential schools and boarding schools. And I saw the names of students that died at Loop in the records, and it was just shocking to see that, their names listed and then, the word dead or died. And sometimes they had the reason like influenza or smallpox or tuberculosis, but sometimes it just said dead. So that was, I took a sample of the enrollment records. Just, every 4 years I looked at the names of individuals, and for just every 4 years between 1909 and the 1930s, there was about 24 students that I counted that passed away at Old Loop. And there's probably more because I didn't look at all of the records. And that was really shocking to find that out. And also another thing was just one thing that I really liked was hearing the old stories about how some of the children, they did still continue to have a relationship with their families. There were 2 sisters, Lucinda Machin and Hope Harrison, who talk about their grandparents coming to visit them at Loop and bringing traditional foods. Like, they would bring mutton sometimes, or they would bring watermelon, and they would park behind this, because Loop had a problem with flooding, and they had built this really high, 8-foot high earthen, what they call a dike, around the eastern and northern part of the school to keep out the floodwaters of the Little Colorado River. And so the grandparents would park behind that earthen dike, and then they would call their granddaughters over and feed them traditional foods. And so even though they couldn't take their grandkids away from the school, they still came to visit their granddaughters and kept that relationship relationship going. And that was very heartwarming to hear. And also the grandparents, they made sure that they would donate food to the Loop boarding school, and that's one of the things that boarding schools often didn't feed their kids enough food. So you hear a lot of stories about kids, being hungry all the time. And so I thought it was really, great that these grandparents were they wanted to donate sheep, they donated mutton, and they donated melons from their cornfield, and so to the boarding school. So that those are really interesting stories. And also at Loop, I wasn't aware that the policies of boarding schools kind of changed in the 1930s to include more of the culture. So the elders were telling me that they were learning to weave at the Loop boarding school, and all different parts of the weaving, from carding the wool to dyeing the wool to weaving the wool. And when I was looking at the Navajo Nation Museum archives, I was looking at government photographs taken by Milton Snow, who's a government photographer of the early 1920s or early 20th century here on the Navajo reservation. And there were these beautiful, beautiful pictures that he had taken at Loop of children. And it was really emotional. And my mom was there with me, and we were just had tears in our eyes, because for the first time I was finally seeing the kids.
Oh, wow.
Pictures of them.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and those pictures were taken in 1939, and there were a bunch of pictures of the girls learning to weave with the looms in front of them, and their teacher, who was a Navajo woman. Her name was Marie Martin. And they shared with me that this was the only space where they could speak the Navajo language with their Navajo teacher without being punished for speaking. Because if they spoke Navajo, outside of that that weaving space, they would get punished for speaking Navajo. And of all the ways that we've heard of, putting soap in your mouth or being whipped, for speaking Navajo.
Such terrible things for children to go through. And Loop is about 45 minutes to an hour just east of Flagstaff. I go through there all the time when I go back to visit family. The gas station there, buying the green chili hamburgers off the side of the road. So that's a good stop, just FYI.
Definitely.
Yeah, I've been through it many times. But what you're talking about, too, with your report, your essay, An Early History of Hatatli Yajibeotka, the Little Singer School, was what it translates to, was kind of a response to these federal Indian boarding schools that actually tried to promote the culture and knowledge of the Diné.
Yeah, exactly. This little Hatatli Yaji, he was a great medicine man, and he was well known in the area and also into New Mexico. He knew many different Navajo ceremonies. He was known for his generosity, his love of children. He adopted many children who didn't have parents, and so he was a leader in our community in the early 20th century. And so he really wanted a place, I think, for students to go to school where they didn't have to leave home and go to boarding school, because he commented on how quiet the community was and how unnatural that was without the children, because it's not, it's unnatural to not have children around playing or, helping their parents or hearing their laughter, hearing, babies cry, or, whatever, all the noises that kids make. So he just really felt that the children had to come home. They had to bring the children back into the community, and a school was one idea that they had thought of different ideas, like a museum or a culture center, and then a school, and at the time my mother's late husband, Tom Ryan, he was an Anglo man who was living in Winslow, and he befriended a lot of the Navajos, because Winslow's right next door to Bird Springs, where I'm from and where the school is. And he learned so much about how the Diné people were living, and he was so horrified by families having to take their children, to these boarding schools that they weren't able to, take their kids home until the end of the school year. And he was like, how is this happening in America right now? This is horrible. This doesn't make sense. So when they asked him if he could help them build a school, he was really happy to do it. And he really just befriended a lot of Navajo families, the community, and he was a scientist. He was a nuclear physicist, and he had gone to school at Berkeley, and so he used his contacts in California to help raise money. He used his contacts with Foothills College, invited the students from there to help lay the foundation and for the Little Singer School, and so that's how the community really wanted something to bring the children home, and they asked my stepfather, Tom Ryan, for help, and he answered that call.
Oh, and you were a student there?
Yes, I was. So it's a big love story in our family, how my mother initially, my mother had met Tom when he was starting to work at the school, but at that time, she was a student at NAU. She was married, and then my mother got divorced later, and then she was raising my three sisters and I as a single mom. And we came back for a celebration dinner for Tom because the school was going to be open. It was done. And so my mom and my stepdad, fell in love. And as a result, it always seems ironic to me that my mother married a white man, and that was the reason why we moved back to the reservation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because that's where he was living in my community. So we moved back to Birch Springs, and my sisters and I started school there in 1979. And it was a really, really special place because we had been going to school before in Flagstaff. But it was just something different to be able to go to school with your relatives, to be able to go to school where Navajo's being spoken all the time, because all this, at that time, 95% of the students spoke Navajo fluently. And probably me and my sisters were the only ones, because we were kind of like urban Indians since we had been living in Flagstaff, that weren't fluent Navajo speakers. But that's where my sisters and I learned how to read and write the Navajo language, because we were taught how to read the Navajo language at Little Singer School. And definitely, elders would come to the school all the time. They could come anytime and, sit in the classroom. They would come as guest speakers. We butchered sheep at the school, and the elders taught us how to do that. And they also, we participate in Navajo song and dance competitions. I think it was in Rough Rock or Round Rock, way over on the other side of the res. Mm-hmm. And we learned Yebache songs, gourd dancing. So all of those important Navajo cultural singing and dancing, and the language and the teachings, along with learning, the regular subjects of, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Reading in English and learning to read in Navajo. So it was such a, the happiest time in my education. And we were very lucky too, because my stepdad had designed the school to rely on renewable energy, which was really, my stepdad was very much always thinking about the future. And so, he knew that it would be best to have renewable energy, because there was no electricity there in Birch Springs at that time. And it's still like that to this day on the reservation. Mm. So he wanted to have install solar panels for to heat the school, and wind generators to harness the wind for the electricity.
Well, you bring up the future, and I know that part of your work is looking at the past, right?
Yeah.
At a time when 95% of the students were fluent when you went, and now the numbers show that the number of fluent younger speakers is diminished pretty significantly. Where do you see our culture heading? I mean, as someone who's probably looked at other cultures and of the past. I mean, Native people are obviously resilient. We're still here. How hard is it to keep up those cultural ties, especially since we live in this day and age?
Yeah. I think it's really hard. I mean, I really commend all of the young people that are really trying to learn their traditional ways and keep. One thing I see about the young people today is, to me, they're very strong, and to me, they're not afraid. And it's not just like Native Americans. I think like it's all young people.
Mm-hmm.
They want a better future, and they're not afraid to make those demands, make those changes, come up with ideas. And I also see Native people, exactly like that. I feel like Native people are really, they're, really working hard to make sure that indigenous people remain indigenous, remain strong in our culture and our language and our rights, especially, our human rights, our environmental, social, all this social justice, fighting for all of our rights. I really see our young people, they have a lot of courage, I think, and they're really brave, and they're not quiet. They're not afraid to speak out, and I really admire them for that. And they're very creative too. I think they're very innovative and creative. So I have hope. I have hope for our future. I feel like we as Native people are strong, and we survived colonization, and I feel we are going to keep surviving into the future, and I feel like we're getting stronger.
All right. And Dr. Davina Two Bears will end on that note. Thank you so much for being on my podcast, Here Before, Here Now. That's going to do it for this episode, everyone. If you have any requests, or if you think that someone would make a good guest on this podcast, please reach out to me, colton.schoen@azfamily.com. Until next time.
You are listening to Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.